Francisco Goldman and Susan Choi.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Susan.
We're on.
We're on. You up in New York and me down in Mexico City.
And you're in Mexico City. You're not in Brooklyn.
No,
I'm so excited to be here with you. I guess I'm going to introduce me. I'm Susan Choi. I'm so excited to be with one of my favorite living writers and human beings, Francisco Goldman, not sitting in Brooklyn together, but sitting in this virtual space provided by the 92nd Street Y, which is wonderful in a different way. And I look forward, Frank, to seeing you in person. I'm so excited about your book, which I adore, and actually read for a second time today and was, I thought like I'd read it just to refresh my memory. And then I was like completely enthralled and I felt like I was reading it for the first time, even though I remembered so much, but it was like an undiminished pleasure. And I'd love for you to read a little bit before we start talking. Are you going to read?
I just want to also, thank you so much, Bernard, 92nd Street Y, having me back. And for me, Susan's one of my favorite people, one of my dearest friends, one of my absolute favorite writers, and has been for since we first met, since her first book came out, a little after we first met in Provincetown, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was. In fact, I was going to say something about that too, but I'll wait until after you read it.
It's very nice stuff. Okay, this book. Where'd Susan? This book has a present tense narrative that's the frame of the book that narrates a 5-day trip home. In between cycling throughout that 5-day trip home are stories that kind of tell the story of a life that's almost reached 50 years. But the heart of the 5-day trip home, in which Francisco Goldberg visits various people, is a long visit to his mother in a nursing home. He's somebody who, as much as he loves his mom, has been in some ways a distant son. He's lived out of the United States a lot, in Mexico, in Central America, sometimes working as a journalist in Europe. And because he got in some trouble, got some sort of warning threats in Mexico. He's based on work he'd done in Guatemala. He's come back to New York for the first time in 10 years, really, to live. And one of the things that has been a part of that he's kind of really happy that he came back. One thing that makes him happy that he did come back is that it's given him his chance to visit his mother a lot. And his mother is a Guatemalan woman. She had a very tough marriage, which is part of the story, a brutal marriage to the father figure, who is also an immigrant, Ukrainian Jewish man. He's now passed away a few years before. He was about 20 years older than her, and she is in the nursing home with a kind of onset dementia, not yet severe, kind of goes in and out, and it's part of it figures into this. You'll see here even the conversations they have. And so I'm just going to read a little bit from near the beginning of his long visit to his mom in the nursing home, and a little bit from near the end of that visit. I skip right to it. Mamita, I ask her, what was the name of that boarding house you and Dolores Ojito lived in? It's like we're starting the same conversation we had last visit. She told me the name. I'd even written it down, but I lost that notebook. So often they fall from my pocket. She must have moved into the boarding house during the spring of 1952, because that's when Doroteo Guamuch Flores won the Boston Marathon. And I know Abuelita was up here with Mamita, because she always liked telling about how together from somewhere along the course, they'd cheered their compatriot on. My mother's gaze withdraws back in time, her rust-hued lashes quiveringly lowered. Our Lady, she stammers, I know, Frankie, no sé. Then she quickly pronounces as if under a spell, Our Lady's Guild House. That's it, I've looked it up before. A rooming house attached to a convent of cloistered nuns, the Daughters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, still in operation, a brick and granite building on an exposed corner of Charlesgate Road and the Pike, only blocks from the Berkeley School of Music, where my mother would spend the last 15 years or so of her working life. Mamita, isn't it true that you were a distinguished professor of marimba at Berkeley? Ay, hijo, and laughter trills out of her soft body shaking in her wheelchair. As a son, I have countless feelings, but I've always been good at making Mamita laugh. Back when she was a Guatemalan working girl in Boston, a bilingual secretary in her 20s, boarding at Our Lady's, what would she have thought if she could have glimpsed her future? A professor at Berkeley, teaching Spanish, not marimba, to some of the world's most gifted student musicians. Would it have seemed the fulfillment of a dream, or did she dream of something else? Now, even mundane questions can seem to task her mind the way a perplexing riddle might, and her eyes flood with anxiety. You don't remember what your dream for the future was back then, Mommy? No, frankly, she says firmly, I don't. I've also noticed how her anxiety eases when she can respond to a question with an answer she feels sure of. You were just happy to be in Boston, probably, I say, having fun, you and Dolores Ojito, going out on dates with those Harvard foreign grad school muchachos, Spiggy Brzezinski, no less, right, Mommy? That makes her smile. One evening when I was home from college and we were watching the news on the portable TV in the kitchen, President Carter introducing new members of his cabinet. My mother's eyes went wide and she exclaimed, Spiggy. She knew him from her single working girl days in Boston, it turned out, when she used to get invited to foreign grad student parties. After one of those parties, Zbigniew Brzezinski had carried her in his arms across a muddy Harvard yard. I asked her what he was like, and she responded, Spiggy was like a lion. Ay, mamita, how did a niña bien from the tropics like you ever end up in a joint like this? That's another of our routines. Whenever I visit her at Green Meadows, I ask her that, and she always answers the same way. I no sé, hijo, and that deep giggle that rolls on into helpless yelps of laughter. Now I'll jump ahead to later, near the end of the visit. He's brought to his mother, like he always does, when he visits her, a tin of French butter cookies. You know, one of those tins with the Eiffel Tower on it? It's like her favorite kind of cookie. I've wheeled Mamita upstairs to her room again. She sits on her bed with her back to Susan Cornwall, who's returned from her hospital outing. I'm in the chair in the corner facing my mother, the tin of French butter cookies on my lap. We've each just eaten a cookie. I offered one to Susan Cornwall, too, who now, on her back under her blanket, is eating her cookie in a slow, savoring nibbles. Since we returned to her room, Mamita's been answering my questions without even the usual hesitation. I offer her another cookie, take one for myself, and sensing that there's not going to be a better moment than this one, I ask, Mommy, in all the years you were with Daddy, did you ever have an affair? She's just taken a bite of her cookie, and as if stimulated by baked French butter and sugar and a humming afternoon tea lucidity, Mamita answers, Yes, I did. You did, Ma, really? Yes, she says. She smiles wanly and says, Just one, Frankie. Was his name Miguel, I ask? But Frankie, how do you know that? Yes, Miguel, she says, slightly widening her eyes. He was from Mexico City. He worked for Honeywell, but Honeywell brought him to Boston for a year to learn about their new computers. It's so obvious that they must have met at the Latin American Society of New England that I don't even ask. Mamita, I say, I'm really happy to hear this. I'm so happy for you that you had a love affair. She sits back, her expression girlishly complacent. My words are heartfelt, but I also feel a little bad. Still, I can't stop myself, and I ask, Mamita, when you and Miguel wanted to be alone together, where did you go? Sometimes we used to meet at the Hilltop Sheraton, she answers. The Hilltop Sheraton, really? It's as if the French butter cookies have drugged my mother like a truth serum. The Hilltop Sheraton is in our town, out by Route 128. On summer nights in high school, we'd sometimes sneak into the swimming pool there. I ask, this was around when I was in high school, right? She thinks this over and says, yes, it was. So what happened? What happened? Well, he had to go back to Mexico, Frankie. Hi, Mommy, I say, I'm so sorry. Were you very sad? Yes, I was sad, she says. Did you love him, Ma? And with that tone of voice and enunciation that reminds me of a polite contestant in a 1950s quiz show who masters her composure Even as she knows she is providing the winning answer, Amita says, yes, I did love him, Frankie. And this Miguel, he is the one who gave you the teachings of Don Juan and those other Carlos Castaneda books? She laughs quietly. Oh, I don't remember, she says, but he did like to read. I am a controlled warrior, I say. Do you remember that one, Ma? Your favorite Don Juan quote? Recognition, like two tiny fragile bubbles of light, float up into her eyes. Is that what that is? Do you remember, Ma? I repeat. I am a controlled warrior. She giggles a little. Yes, she says, I do. Now she's smiling to herself. Was he kind of a hippie type? He had long hair, she says, and laughs again, but not as long as yours used to be. But yes, Frankie, he enjoyed life. He enjoyed life, I repeat. But you mean in a laid-back way? In a what way, she asks. He wasn't a drinker or a big party guy, I say. Oh no, she says. He had a tranquil personality. A tranquil personality, not like Daddy. I know, she says. Do you still think about Miguel? It was only a year, you know, she says, and only in Boston. But I have some good memories of Miguel, yes, and she smiles with closed lips. After he left, did you ever see him again, Ma? I was going to take a summer course on Mexican writers in Cuernavaca, on Juan Rulfo and some others, she says. She pauses, seems to be holding herself as still as she can, as if that will help her remember, though suddenly her eyelashes rapidly blink. But no, she says, I didn't go, Frankie. We never saw each other again. She sits with her hands folded in her lap, staring off. But when she lifts her gaze to me, she lifts one hand over the end of her arm's chair, raises her chin, a look like calm satisfaction in her eyes, and an avid glint behind, like the very tip of a new memory rising. Something in her posture and poise reminds me of that oil portrait of her in her evening gown that hung in our living room. Now she looks down at the floor. Well, I'm proud of you, Mommy, I say, that you were brave enough to do that, to have your love affair. Yes, Frankie, she says. She looks up again, slightly furrows her brow for a moment, then reaches her hand out for another cookie, and I hold the tin out to her. I feel like a burglar who's broken into her memory. But I also have this thought, which doesn't exculpate me. Besides that warning, this is another reason that I came back from Mexico, to visit my mother at Green Meadows and ask all the questions that finally led to this one. It's as if I've been slowly making my way through the dark, narrow streets of her fading memories to finally discover this one room of light and calm where she keeps her most precious secret. Where was my mother sitting within herself? What did she see around her as she spoke to me? Maybe the past or a dream state or fantasy had displaced the present. Was she really aware of what she was sharing with me? By tomorrow, she might not even remember we had that conversation. But I also sense that she won't have forgotten Miguel, that even if she sometimes loses her way trying to get back to the room, she goes there regularly.
That's one of my very favorite moments in this book. I actually, when I was rereading it this afternoon, it made me cry the way it made me cry the first time I ever read it. And it's one of it's on the 3-page long list of of scenes that I wanted to talk to you about. Three pages single spaced and printed out for my computer, which we're clearly not going to have time to get to. But there's so much I love about that scene, Frank, and it actually made me kind of understand better what is really kind of tying this whole amazing book together. This book that like made me like laugh a lot and shed a lot of tears when I read it, both times. This is a book that is about adolescence and it's about old age and dying. And but what I realized as you were reading, and also I'm indebted to Dave Davies because he did that great interview with you a couple of days ago that I'm just totally piggybacking on, is you said to him a few days ago that you felt like this book was partly about why it took so long to learn how to love. And I feel like that process is that question, why did that take so long, lies behind the writing about adolescence that you do here and the writing about old age and memory and, calling yourself a burglar or forgive me, this is actually my first question for you, is like, let's talk about this narrator, this protagonist, Francisco Goldberg. Like, who is this guy? Who is this I who's speaking in your book? Talk about him.
Well, first of all, it's a big step simply displacing that man with Berg, right? I remember when seeing that Jeffrey Myers, the guy who did Austin Powers on TV, and he had just come to Cannes. He'd done his first trip to Cannes, and he said, I'm from Canada. That place is called Cannes, and let me tell you, that ADA makes a big difference. That switch right away was the first step into creating fiction, even if the components of that fiction were drawn so often on my own life. But with friends, right? There was not ever in my life a compact series of visits to my mother over a period of months where I was interrogating her in this way. Yet over years I was, right? But to get back to the original question, this book is a before and after in my writing life. Clearly, we're always looking in fiction for ways to express ourselves through narrative fiction. That's how we think in narrative and stories, and how we process everything. But my early books, which were in part so shaped by my experiences throughout my whole 20s in Central America, for example, were books that, the way novels do, looked outward, right? Like the first novel is going to combine the experience of being in your 20s in the Central American Wars in Guatemala with other things about growing up in Massachusetts and things like that, right? And the second book and the third book were books that looked outward like that. And then in 2007, when my Aura died at age 30 in a terrible swimming accident, that's the after. And that changed my writing and made me look in. Mm-hmm. Right? And Say Her Name, which was the book I wrote in response, after my during a period of heavy grieving, was the first of those books, and it was a book that was, most of all, it wanted to really both get the reader as close as I could get the reader to who Aura was, right? Whether I had to use fiction or nonfiction or anything, right, to put her there, and also give you a sense of, tell the grief story and give you a sense of what grief was like, traumatic grief. And at that grief back then, I got obsessed with this sort of question because I was so full of guilt, right? And I used to say, I met and fell in love with Aura when I was 47. And that was the first time I'd ever really been in love. That was the first time I was ever really able. I'd been in love before, but it was the first time I'd ever been able to be in a healthy love, receive love, give love, make a beautiful relationship. And in my horrible guys, I say, what fucked me up so much? Why did I have to wait till I was 47? If I'd been like a normal person and fallen in love and gotten married and I was 33, Aura would never have met me and she'd be alive. That's a crazy way to think, but I'm in grief. That's how you're thinking, right? And I would feel just tremendous anger at my father because I knew he was one of the reasons, right? Because our house was a hell, frankly, right? A loveless house,
mm-hmm.
Where we all quaked in fear of his violence.
Yeah.
And I also realized, at times I'd never been to a therapist, but I had to go to a grief therapist. And she was really obsessed with my youth and had this idea that it had been horrible because the home was bad, but she also knew that my adolescence had been subjected to all kinds of bad things. It was a very white, working class Boston rough town in which like so many of the kids this is going to be some things up nowadays. So many of the kids I went to high school with, some of them I'm still in touch with, turning into Trump voters. Right, that tells you kind of all you need to know, and so
that's not surprising at all.
Yeah,
given how actually like compassionately and really illuminatingly you write about them. I feel like I've met these kids.
Yeah,
Space and Bonks and Ian.
Yeah, it was so important to me to get back because they were so important in my formation. I realized that it was just time for me to look back and say, what happened? right? So I said, what would have happened if I'd never met Auda? You know, so here he's 49. He hasn't met Auda. There's a train trip where you see if that train trip had been completed, he would have met her. If you know, say her name by heart, you'll recognize that moment. It's not
the one that gets actually stopped in the snow by the suicide on the tracks, and he never makes it to the event.
The event where, if you know, that's where he met Auda. I met Auda, right?
Yeah.
And so it was a way to interrogate my life and look back, and also, and just let me say this briefly, right? I was really thinking about in this book hierarchies and categories too, right? The way other people put you in categories and what that does to your career, certainly in writing, and maybe things you have to struggle against sometimes, and the kinds of categories and hierarchies you impose on yourself. And so I use the example a lot that, you know, we have incredibly great writers in the United States have had who like spent 1 year as soldiers or journalists in Vietnam and spent the rest of their life writing about it, right? You think of Tim O'Brien, you know, a few times he didn't, right? Michael Hare, never, you know, and my years in such a way, you never stop asking yourself, what do I owe to that experience? What more can I say that will honor the tragedies I saw, the deaths I saw, the outrageous crimes, you know, and the beautiful courage I was witness to. And you tend to like say, I can't think about high school. Central America is so important, you know? And of course, you know, so I said, well, if you were going to think about a 5-day trip home, if you're on a 5-day trip home, what are you going to be thinking about? You're going to be thinking about, you're going home, so you're going to be thinking about home, you're going to be thinking about high school, adolescence, you're going to see your mom, you're going to be thinking about your mom. You're still going to be that person who lived those things in Central America. But you're not going to be, that's not going to be your main preoccupation on those 5 days. You're going to be, you know, you're trying to fall in love. You're thinking about your love life, all these things, right? And so that was how this was for. There it is right there, I think.
All of that stuff, I mean, all of the most important things that you are exploring in all of your work, they all start there. I mean, you find them all in those early adolescent like experiences, especially when you said categories. I mean, the first thing I thought of course, was, you know, the gotcha moment in your book, right? So in the book, Francisco Goldberg goes home and he is you know, enjoying this short-lived moment of triumph because his first book has just come out, and he's gonna, he thinks, be the subject of this nice feature, right, in like the local hometown newspaper. And he meets this journalist, and it's like, tell what happens. Like, can you tell that story? Because I know it's based on a real story.
You know, this is the way the stories get told from the past in this book. This is, I've edited this just so I could be a short reading.
Yeah.
This really happened. It's unbelievable, right? And it's the kind of thing my editor loves to tell this story about me, Morgan, my publisher, right? And I just, all these years went by, and also it's important, you know, as a kid, right? And this is a big part of the book and about my relationship to my mother was the kind of mother who was constantly telling me, don't forget you're Guatemalan too. You're Guatemalan too. You know, she would never become a U.S. citizen until very late. And in reaction to that, because in my town, the least helpful thing you could do growing up in a town like mine was to go around telling people you were Guatemalan. Right?
That's not
identity. And so in response to that, I became an obsessed American Revolution nerd. Right? And even though I was a student, I just knew everything about the American Revolution, and that led to me being a tour guide, becoming a tour guide, you know, just with this big black curly, those little, on the Boston Tea Party ship on the bicentennial summer, which was so crazy because I just knew everything about the American Revolution. And the guy, you know, interviewed me and hired me. He met me at summer camp, and and now I love to go back to the Boston Tea Party ship. Whenever you go back now, this is the difference between in the 70s, you could have this mestizo kid with big black, you know, be the Boston Tea Party ship guide. Now, every time you go on that ship, it's guys who look like, you know, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon.
Of course.
You know, real John Wayne types fitting and I love to tell them, you know, I used to have your job, and they just think I must be lying, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's important to know because this is where that scene is set, right? Yes. About 15 years ago now, when my first novel was published, I came to Boston to give my first ever bookstore reading. And the next morning, I received a phone call from my book's publicist telling me that a reporter from the Globe wanted to talk to me in person. The novel had been featured on the front page of the newspaper's Sunday Arts section. And now a new newspaper profile. That was a first, too. The publicist was excited, and I was, too. I suggested that the reporter and I meet right here where I'm standing now, on the Congress Street Bridge. That way, I'd be able to gesture at the Tea Party ship and say, during my senior year in high school, and on into that bicentennial summer, I worked here as a tour guide. I used to especially like to sit up on that crow's nest. The publicist thought it was a good promotional idea to stress my local roots. Fred Terrell was the reporter's name. He arrived at the bridge before me and was standing by the rail overlooking the ship. He looked around 60, about my height, and was wearing a beige raincoat that accented the slump of his shoulders, short curly white hair, small gray mustache, wide apart blue-gray eyes, large head, cetacean almost. Fred Terrell said hello, spoke my name without smiling, shook hands with a quick squeeze. The overcast sky, the reporter's unexpected lack of warmth, a premonition maybe, made me think of spies in Cold War movies who arrange a rendezvous on a bridge to exchange information, after which they depart in opposite directions, except one spy walks a few blocks and is murdered. The reporter didn't congratulate me on my novel or attempt any banter. He said, I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, Francesco, but it's best I get to the point. We received the facts at the newspaper that makes a serious allegation we feel obligated to follow up on. Do you know a woman named Lana Gatto? Yes, we went to high school together, I answered, but I haven't seen or heard from Lana in years. I felt apprehensive but also mystified. Fred Terrell spoke the name of the high school, and I said, that's right. But what did Lana Gatto, the faded memory of that teenage girl, mean to me? Here I was, having just published my first novel, reviewed on the cover of the Sunday Arts section of Fred Terrell's newspaper. The large photo of my face on that page, now serving as birdcage liner and laid over floors for puppies to pee on all over New England. And now here was Mr. Fred Terrell of the Globe asking about Lana Gatto, who I hadn't seen once in 17 years. But the mention of Lana Gatto evoked what it always does, not primarily a memory of Lana herself, but of an autumn Sunday afternoon of sophomore year, when I found myself walking with Marianne Lucas and Lana across our high school football field after a varsity game to the steep grass-covered hill that our high school sat atop, looking out over the town. Marianne and Lana were singing Come Together. They knew all the words, in unison flapping their hands outward from the wrists and snapping their fingers to the abrupt beats. I felt incredibly happy to be there, included in their cool girlfriend intimacy as they sang that song. And I thought something like, this is what being a teenager is, or I can't believe this is me, walking across the football field with these two girls. Fred Terrell said, Francesco, the reason I asked to meet with you today is that in her fax to us, Lana Gatto alleges that you are not a Hispanic or a Latino. She says that in high school your name was Frank and that you're Jewish. According to Ms. Gatto, you had a nickname everybody knew you by. And he glanced down at a notepad he pulled from the pocket of his raincoat, folded open to the page he wanted, and said, Galls. He looked at me as if silently willing himself show no facial expression. I answered, yes, Mr. Terrell, I admit it, I am Jewish. And all these years I've been hiding my true identity behind the last name Goldberg. It would have been great if Fred Terrell had published our exchange in his newspaper, but he ended up not writing any story, probably wanting to recover some dignity, which is sometimes impossible to do for a person who, after all, has just lost it. Fred Terrell said, as you might know, recently there have been other cases of authors turning out not to be what and who they claim. So we do need to follow up when something like this crosses our desks. He must have been referring to the case of the novel about a Chicano that turned out to have been written by a Jewish guy using the surname Suarez or Sanchez. Book and publicity spurting author from the barrio were a sensation until he was outed then book and author were nuked. That's what Fred Terrell thought he was going to get to do to me, thanks to his deep throat source, Lanagato. But my answer landed like a clean punch to his puffy dwarf face. You got me, man. My name's Goldberg, I reiterated with a shrug. And Francesco? Fred Terrell asked tensely, a mean little curl to his lip. Lanagato says that nobody called you by that name. Francisco, I think you mean. You know, like in San Fran, the California city? Nope, they sure didn't, Mr. Terrell. Growing up, I always went by Frank, but I was named for my mother's father. Come on, man, you know what people are like around here. You think I was going to run around my high school waving a Guatemalan flag and insisting kids call me Francisco? Lanagato also wrote in her facts, said Fred Terrell, speaking through visibly gritted teeth, that she was in your Spanish class and that you failed. That's not true, I said. I got a C-. You want me to say something to you in Spanish? That's all right, said Fred Terrell, slumping a little. Look, I'm sorry to have brought you out here only for this. He put his hands into his overcoat pockets and looked like he only wanted to go and get a drink.
I love that scene. I really love the moment at which Francisco Goldberg says, yeah, you got me. I'm a Jew. I've been hiding it all the while under this highly deceptive surname Goldberg. You know, it's like listening to you read. I mean, you and I have had conversations for years about this question of identity and the really like difficult strictures that are placed on writers who don't fit into a convenient categorization, a categorization that's like convenient to mainstream American culture, which hasn't really changed as much as you would think it might have in the time since you and I started talking about this, right? And talking about, you know, our own like very different, but not totally dissimilar experiences of like, you know, hyphenated identity, right? Like I'm Jewish too, but people, you know, for me, people are always like, you're Jewish? How could it be? You're Asian. I don't like, can you bring this back to adolescence and this project of learning how to love, like, as you said so beautifully, give and receive love. Like, I feel like there's a connection here because, you know, as is clear from your scene, but not just because Lanagato ends up being like, you know, the freaking like spy in the high school who like tries to out you as like a Latino dude who flunked Spanish. So he must be like some kind of like, call the identity police here. But like, is there a connection, do you think, to this struggle, the struggle in terms of selfhood? Like who or what are we? And I hear somebody. And is that part of like the struggle to love, do you think?
I think so. That is such a brilliant question. I had not, you know, all this tour, I've had to deal with this issue a bunch of times. It's never been put to me in that way, which really gets to the heart of the book. You know, and yes, right. I think that when we are in conflict with ourselves and other people over and resentful and hurt by how our identity is working in the society, so that we even do harm to ourselves with, for instance, elements of even self-hatred. If only, you know, my last name was Molina, if only, you know, these kinds of, you know, things that aren't accepting yourself, right? You're less worthy of receiving and giving love too, right? And one of the other germs of this book, because I remember reading in is it called White Girls, the Hilton Als book?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. And in the first chapter, he tells the story of an adolescence of being like a girl he was in love with in high school, who was half Jewish and half Puerto Rican. And part of her problem was in New York, she felt like she wasn't allowed to be either. Mm-hmm. It was so strict, you had this or that, right? And he says in that book, and it blew me away when he wrote this, he said, you know, the particular stupidity of New York is its need to categorize everything and its ability to only categorize the obvious, right? Mm-hmm. And which, you know, and what's more obvious than the last name, like Goldman, right? So that, I mean, the kinds of assumptions that people will make about you, and don't let them, right? But it can be, in the writing world especially, it can really be a drag, right? Because, here I am, son of a Guatemalan, spent half my childhood in Guatemala, been married twice to Mexican women, live all my life in Latin America, and yet somehow the Jewish last name will often in New York be used to sort of seem to question my authenticity or something, right? And in the West Coast, this doesn't happen. West Coast, because West Coast is so Latin American, they understand that Latin America is in itself a truly mestizo culture. Like, no one in Mexico gets upset about a Jewish last name. Everyone in Mexico is blood, right? And so, but the point is, like, this book's journey, and if you call it a journey, it's a trip, because it's a trip home. It's not a journey, right? But it culminates in a kind of acceptance and a realization of what being half and half truly is, right? And he gets part of this from the example of Natalia Ginsburg, right? Who used to say, she was grew up Jewish. Grew up in a secular family with a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, like I did. She, even though she was surrounded by Italian Catholic fascists, just to feel normal and fit in, she used to wish she was Catholic. You understand that's okay. That's how kids are, right? Yeah. And it's really like making yourself so absurd was this line that I used to repeat since childhood, like, I'm half Jewish and half Catholic. What does that mean? You can't be half Catholic. You can't be half a religion, right? And
kind of all or nothing.
And what you eventually realize, and what's the essence of mestizohood, and what Natalia Ginsburg said, someone used to said, I'm fully Jewish and I'm fully Catholic. I'm both. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is. These are her heritages.
Yeah.
And we're fully both. I'm fully Jewish. I'm fully Latin American.
Yeah.
I'm fully who I am. This is my entity, and I'm so comfortable with that.
Don't you think, it's amazing. You didn't want to use the word journey, so I'm going to try to avoid it. But it is an amazing trip that the book takes, not just through physical space. You write so beautifully about like traveling in New England, but into the past. But thinking about Natalia Ginsburg, don't you think that part of the way in which she, and I love her too, and don't you think part of the way in which her story is a little bit different and kind of gives us a direction, or gives us like a model, for lack of a better word, is she grows up in this incredibly vibrant, tight-knit family, this like almost dream of like this crazy intellectual family where there's always all sorts of nutty stuff going on, but the parents are together. The father is a bit of a tyrant. I remember he's like horrible with the hiking boots and stuff, but you write so courageously. Well, I just want to say, you write here so courageously about growing up in a family that is not that. Like, it's so isolating. The bond between, there's no bond between parents here. It's total alienation and warfare. And so don't you think it took longer to kind of find your way to?
There's a wonderful moment of contrast, because when you realize that in Family Lexicon, right, the big tragedy in Natalia Ginsburg's life is Leon, her husband, who's a hero of the resistance, right? He's taken prisoner by the SS and tortured to death, right? And in Family Lexicon, she only briefly refers to that. That loss is sort of defining the book in some ways, right? And I couldn't, and what it took me, Leon Ginsburg and my father were born a year apart in the Ukraine. You can't have two more different men. No, and that really sort of made things clear to me. And what I did take, I have to admit, you know what you want from yourself when you're writing a book, and I wanted, Family Lexicon was an influence on me. So a bunch of writers like Grace Paley and Chekhov, and something that grew out of even writing, say her name, was this desire to just get really close to the characters. Everything.
Close to, say again?
Close to the characters.
Yeah.
Going around visiting every person. To me, what I wrote so hard to I just tried to get that transparency in the prose, so that you wouldn't feel, the style, let's say, as a barrier between you and that character. You wouldn't stop to think, I wanted that character to just really breathe off the page, and speak off the page.
Yeah.
And
you absolutely succeed. It's uncanny. I mean, even, toward the end, like when we finally see Maria, is it Jum?
Jum, yeah.
Maria Jum in her laundromat, or, when Feli comes I mean, another thing I love about this book is your portrayal of women, all of the women in Goldberg's life, not just his mother and his sister, but this series of young women who kind of came to this country to be companions, like sort of nanny, a little bit of like an au pair situation, but totally different. And the enormous impact they have on Goldberg's life, just by bringing, an additional kind of, I guess, female solidarity and some love into this like very troubled house. And when we meet them finally, when we meet Feli, especially when she comes like careening up in her car, I mean, Frank, like, I feel like I've met all these people, you know what I mean? Yeah. Because your writing achieves them so beautifully. I feel like I can hear them.
Somebody told me the other day, I thought it was a wonderful comment, a Mexican academic friend. She said, this book is like your Todo sobre su madre. The Almodovar movie, all about everything about my mother, right? Yeah. It is, it is, my mother's really the heart of the book, right?
Yeah.
And so the book was a journey into like the realization, and this is also when you talk about being able to, this is part of giving and receiving love too, I think. So much of my early life was like, I do not want to be like my father. I am not anything he did, I want to do the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a negative way to live. And I began to realize that I'm really my mother's son. It's not so much that I'm not my father's son. I mean, my mother is the person who really gave me so much and defined so much of my life's, my life's journey, and my sensibility and my values and the places I like to go and the places, I like to live and the way I like to live. And also, yes, it was a house of women. It was like my world was women. It was nobody my mother loved more than her own mother. Because my mother's mother was a ferocious Catholic, like one of those women in a Graham Greene novel who just, no matter how horrible the marriage is, divorce is out of the question. So she would not let my mother divorce.
Well, this is like one of the great tragedies of your mother's life is that her mother, whom she adores, forbids her to leave this marriage. She tries to leave your father
several times.
Yeah. And her own mother, who she loves more than anyone else in the world, is the one who keeps sending her back into the trenches again and again.
Yeah.
And just says, you can't leave.
And to make it bearable, like you were just saying, she sends women up to help, so that my mother can have a career. My mother then decides, well, I'm going to make myself a teacher.
Yeah.
A professor. Teacher first, then professor. And she has to go to school, during the day and things in the afternoon. So she sends up a series of women from Guatemala. And I say, at one point, it's like, because now enough years have passed, so some of them have already become grandmothers. So it's like this colony sent by Abuelita, my grandmother from Guatemala. There's a little colony of these women now in Massachusetts, right?
Yeah, I love the way you just at one point you described this kind of parade of young women sent by Abuelita to help your mother in terms of how long it takes them to get married and leave. And I think one of them is in your house for like 4 days, and then she like finds a boyfriend, gets married, and leaves.
All get married and leave. And there's this one who came up. It's true that she was very kind of striking looking. She was sexy, obviously sexy in a way the others were. And who knows? And she was there with us like in less than 2 weeks. She'd left to get married. But I never understood what happened. It was really funny, And it was. And they all they all stayed in touch in various ways, with my mother. Maria Jum was fictional. I had really had fun writing Maria Jum because she is someone we lost touch class. I brought her back, but Feli, that decisive conversation, because a lot of this trip too, a lot that happened in the last years, and this is what happens too when your mother is starting to get old and people know. My mother passed away in the middle of the writing of this book, too. and my mother, who was so obsessed with, like, still wanted a grandchild. And to think that on her deathbed, she hadn't, people said that she hadn't smiled in weeks, people said, when we arrived, because she didn't have those kinds of muscle memory anymore or something. And she looked at my wife Jovi, and Jovi didn't yet know she was pregnant. She just glowingly, radiantly smiled at Jovi. And to this day, that smile, I swear, it was a divine smile. She knew. Yeah. She somehow knew, and it was probably the last time she smiled in her life.
Yeah.
And it was just an incredible moment. So a lot of this book was, saying goodbye to my mom too. That's, it didn't start out that way because I was deep into the book when that happened. And also the question of love, right? And the sister, right? The relationship with the sister is incredibly important in this book. And, I know that my sister and I were apart for many years because of the way the strife worked on us in the family. It created problems, jealousies.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy we're closer now.
Yeah.
A lot closer now. And I see, when I look at my family, I see all of them as women. Myself, I'm the man, but my mother and my sister, of course, especially, who had to overcome, all the negative effects of growing up in that house and in that town, especially in that house. I know my sister thinks of it that way,
Well, you write about it as, you were war, like I started noticing the number of times you refer to war in this really intimate story of like family. And you actually set up this opposition, Frank, in terms of your own journey, right? Like you said, as a young writer, as a young man, you were in Central America covering the war. You did all this incredible journalism. You talk about your experience of not really, or your lack of experience of fear in these contexts, almost like drawing a line between, early physical abuse from your father and this sort of ability to just dissociate in a war zone and be incredibly calm. And, but at the same time, I think that there's not so much of a dichotomy there, because you said like focusing on war in Central America and doing all of that journalism like took you away from the self and kept you from looking inward. But all of that stuff seems very connected to me in your work, right? Because when you're writing about home and family and your childhood, you identify it as a war zone, and you identify a lot of moments as war stories, like the story between father and son is a war story, and also the story of your mother, and I love Susan Cornwall, her very disagreeable nursing home roommate, but they're fighting a battle with death, and they're like, and you talk about how they're like two old soldiers, and they're fighting this battle together, this lonely battle at the end of life.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you. Yeah.
But one thing I want to say, because we're starting to run late on time, and I just want to turn to this as well, because your portrayal of women in this book, as in all your books, you're one of the great writers of women, one of the great male writers of women. All that Natalia Ginsburg is really working for you.
Yeah.
And I love the tribute. Like I just love that you name check Muriel Spark really early in the book, one of my favorite writers.
Yeah.
But
also half Jewish. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also have Jewish. And also like had a very problematic relationship to her own Judaism, which reminds me of another thing I want to get to before we run out of time. But I don't want you to fail to talk about writing about the father in this book, because I think that one incredible achievement of this book is that this father, who's clearly a monster in his family, he behaves monstrously to his wife and to his children, is one of the most heartbreaking characters I've ever read. And there are moments in this book where I'm crying onto the page over him, over these moments of moments at which he's able to show love, especially like when they they're in a very raucous betting parlor, and there's a crazy guy yelling at Goldberg, and his father stands up and says, leave my son alone, you bully.
And he's 86 years old.
At age 86. And it's incredible because he's the bully. He's the bully of this book.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
And yet so can you talk about, like, was it hard to write about him? I know he
It was hard to write about him because, it's hard to really paint a portrait of somebody who does evil things, and he's not evil.
Yeah.
It's like, I love my father. I didn't love him at all when I was an adolescent. I hated him. I said, I hated him.
Mm-hmm.
But as I grew older, I began to see him with a mixture of really tragic compassion for his tragedy, admiration for certain aspects of his endurance, of his kind of toughness.
Yeah.
So many of the people who met my father after the college years adored him. My friends, they could not believe that he had been this tyrant,
mm-hmm.
right? He was always just incredible with children, and so it's a crazy. But then again, even in his old age, though, he was still like wore down my mother, right? He was just and the funny, I'm glad I was able to write about him with the love I genuinely felt for him in some ways, even though, even in the book, it's always laced with comedy and irony. Right?
Yeah.
So, at the same time that I also discovered that I can't forgive him. I can forgive him for what he did to me because, I got over it. But I can't forgive what he did to my mother.
Yeah.
And it was one of the shocks in my life because I didn't know. In the book, it takes place in the present tense, which is because it's probably like early in the book, he says he was only violent with me. And he never hit my mother and sister. It was just endless verbal abuse, which is what I thought. And then on a visit home, I see Feli. And because she knows, and she feels like it's time to tell me what she knows. And she tells me about the physical abuse of my father against my mother, which is why she kept trying to leave.
Yeah. And this devastating scene. It's like a primal scene, but it's through her eyes. Because she's the one who saw it, and she protected you. And she protected you. She made sure you didn't ever see.
Yeah. She said, I wasn't afraid of your father. God gave me the strength to get between your mother and father and protect your mother. She's telling me this, right?
Yeah.
And she's kept it secret all these years. And
she's a teenage girl at this time. She's a teenage girl. You're a little boy, and she's a teenager.
15 or 16.
Yeah, and she's literally physically standing between your father and your mother when your father's trying to beat her.
Yeah, she's been sent up from a Guatemala City Catholic orphanage.
Yeah,
there's
so many books in this book, Frank. It's like almost every page there's something in the book where you could write another book about it.
True, and I've thought, I've thought about that many times. It's she's a remarkable woman. I love her so much. She's still alive, and so in the book you discover that. When I think of my poor mom, who grew up in such a loving family, and coming from a milieu where people, although she did, because she was very beautiful. And my grandmother did want to get her out of the country to get her away from that handsome, penniless Italian immigrant, right? It's really why she got sent up to Boston. Although my mother also did not want the life of a housewife in Guatemala, a nice, Latin American wife.
Yeah.
She didn't want that. She wanted something more. She knew that.
And she achieved so much more.
Yeah.
In spite of everything. And I think, this brings us all the way back to where you started, which I guess is a great place to end because we're almost out of time. But I think, your mother's life, you write about it so extraordinarily. And I think that the passage that you read at the beginning in which Goldberg confirms that his mother had a love affair then what moved me so much is, you know, when Goldberg says that he's so proud of her, but then later envisioning that time of her life is like this single room.
Yeah.
A single room of love and happiness. And it's heartbreaking that there's just one room, right? Like that's what you discover, is that she did have this room of refuge, but just one.
Just one, and for 1 year, however it lives on inside her.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, you know, I was also playing, you know, I mean, in all those years I was working on the Bishop Hardy murder case, working so close with prosecutors and investigators. You know, that was a 9-year trial. I really learned the language of evidence, right? And became fascinated by the way good, brilliant prosecutors build cases, build a narrative out of it, and know how to. And, you know, and I playfully adapted that to this novel, remembering, you know, the different little things I remember about my mother, thinking, why for one, you know, she always used to read Garcia Marquez and, you know, Latin. Where did this year of Carlos Castaneda come from?
Yeah. I love that. I love that you really do bring your journalistic sleuthing skills to that Carlos Castaneda detail. It's like, doesn't quite fit. And especially, you know, when the gentle questioning, like, well, was he a hippie kind of guy?
Yeah.
You know, maybe like he had some long hair.
Yeah.
Oh my God, Frank, I could talk to you all night. We're actually out of time. And I just want to know, like, just tell us one last thing that you want us to know about this book that I love so much.
I just feel like when you get, you know, I think the end, which is my, you build a book to be an autonomous toy, as Cesar Iris would put it, right? That's going to like have moving parts that are going to work on their own and chug ahead, right? And work. You know, you kind of set the design, but it takes on its own motion. So when you get to the end of the book, that really was for me. You know, so much of writing is complete struggle. But then there are moments when you feel like you're floating, right? And when that thing happens at the end of the book, you know what I'm talking about? When suddenly the portrait and he's in that with the, that was just, where did that come from? You know? And I hope that you know, I just hope when people reach the end of the book, you know, it's not nothing is super wrapped up, but I just hope you feel, you know, you feel like Frankie Goldberg is gonna have love soon. He seems ready, doesn't he? You know,
yes, he does.
Yeah,
he does. He does. It's a beautiful ending, and I don't want to give it away, but it is almost otherworldly, and it really brings everything full circle in a way that does, I think it does really tell the reader that love comes next, you know.
Yeah.
And
that's not what I really want, right? That you feel why, you know.
Yeah. It's so wonderful. Frank, I adore this book. Congratulations.
I'm so grateful for your support of the book. Really, it means so much to me. You can't imagine. So, and to have someone read the book the way you dream someone would read the book is just amazing.
I just love every book you've ever written, and this book was such a treat for me because it took me back through all of your previous books as well as being an entirely new experience.
Yeah. It's so funny that we were both writing about high school at the same time.
Yeah. Well, we never even got to that, but it's important stuff. I agree. So,
yeah.
That's where we're made, right? That's where we're made. We become the people we are. You know.
In the United States of America, especially if it's public school, we never get over it. Right? Remember the Kurt Vonnegut line? It's like, you know, when you're in high school, you just think, oh my God, you know, life is hell. And then you go to college, you think, oh, life is better. This is how it's going to be. And then you get out of college, you go back into America, and it's high school all over again. It's high school
all over again. It really is. Yeah, college is like this weird vacation that you get before you even understand like how much of a vacation it is. Like you should be allowed to go later.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we'll say good night and wrap it up and thank everyone who's been with us tonight and because this is virtual, everyone who will be with us in the future as we continue to exist in this 2-dimensional space. And Frank, I can't wait to see you in 3-dimensional space.
Soon, in a few weeks.
Yes.
Can't wait to see you.
I can't wait either.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Bernard. And thank you, 92nd Street Y.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. And have a good night.